Thank you very much. I'd like to start by introducing you to this fellow. He's been rather a bad critic of economics for the last 140-odd years. And the way that we've generally dealt with critics in economics is we ignore them. We just go about writing our models and we just ignore the critics. And most of the time that's actually the right thing to do, because you get a lot of crackpots that have their own weird ideas about economics. But the problem is that Karl Marx wasn't entirely a crackpot. And he actually had a fairly serious criticism of economics that we just ignored for a long time. And the basic criticism he had was that in a competitive economy, what happens is I cut my prices to steal customers away from you. And then you cut your prices to steal the customers back, and I cut my prices again, and you cut your prices again, and pretty soon our profits go down to zero. And if all the businesses in the world are making zero profits, who wants to go into business, who wants to start a new business, who wants to make a business grow? And so capitalism kind of ends up being a little bit of a problem. And basically the way we dealt with that was we ignored it. You have to be a little bit generous to Karl Marx. He was German. And so if you try and read this, he has these sentences that go on for a page and a half with 18 subjunctive clauses and all the verbs coming together at the end, and you have to sort of match them back. But this is a charitable interpretation. Now, Marx, of course, was wrong. Capitalism did not collapse. Actually, it was socialism that collapsed. And we think that the reason that Marx was wrong is the ideas of this gentleman, Joseph Schumpeter. He was a professor at Harvard during the 1950s and probably the most preeminent economist for 2 or 3 decades. And then he was almost completely forgotten afterwards. And so we're part of a movement to resurrect his ideas and to bring them back into the mainstream. Schumpeter was an interesting guy. He used to tell his students at Harvard that when he was a young man growing up in Vienna, he had 3 wishes: to be the greatest lover of women in Vienna, to be the greatest horseman in Europe, and to be the greatest economist of his age. And sadly, he had only fulfilled 2 of his 3 childhood ambitions, and he would never tell people which 2. But what Schumpeter said is Marx was wrong. There are 2 ways that firms compete. One is to cut prices and steal customers that way. The other is to come up with a new, better product. So, for instance, Apple can charge more for its iPhone or its iPod, at least for a while, because it doesn't have any competition. It actually has a better thing than all the competitors have. And so it can steal customers away and actually raise its price. And what Schumpeter said is that if you think about 2 kinds of competition, stealing customers from the other guy by lowering your price, and stealing customers from the other guy by coming up with new technology, new ideas or whatever that make your product better, the second one lets you keep your profits high. And Schumpeter said that's why capitalism keeps on functioning, because this competition to innovate is actually the most important kind of competition. And he called this the process of creative destruction. He basically said what has to happen is creative innovators found new firms, build up big firms with new ideas. Microsoft, Apple, Sony in Japan was a firm like this a few decades ago. And these new firms rise up, and all of the old firms that were producing the old products that are no longer as good, all of those firms die. They fall away, they shrink, they disappear. And so the creativity of the creative firms causes the destruction of the uncreative firms, and there's this turnover. And thus capitalism continues generating profits, even though it's not so great for the individual firms that are destroyed. And there's something to this. If you look, this is a picture I think I snapped in Belarus in 1992. This is a Soviet factory, and it's using precisely, exactly the same technology it was using in the 1920s when the Red Army conquered this part of Belarus in the Russian Civil War. Nothing changed from 1920 to 1992. Absolutely nothing changed. Exactly the same kinds of tractors were being made, exactly the same plan, exactly the same workers standing in the same place. Nothing changed. In a socialist economy, of course, that's what you want. If you're a bureaucrat, you don't like change. Change is disruptive. It's annoying. And if there's no reason to innovate, no reason to change, it doesn't happen. And so you could travel around China in 1979 or the Soviet Union in 1992, and you'd go from one industrial museum to another, still operating. So how do we test whether what's good for big companies? Let me come back to the original title. This is General Motors Chairman Charles Wilson. He was nominated by President Eisenhower to be Defense Secretary. And he wanted to be Defense Secretary and not resign his position as chairman of GM. And one of the senators in his confirmation hearing said, don't you think there might be a conflict of interest if you stay on as CEO of GM and you're also Defense Secretary? And this was his famous response to the U.S. Senate. What's good for America is good for GM and vice versa. That's not right. If creative destruction is going on, we want the new creative firms rising up. We don't want the old firms holding on. And so to try and see whether Schumpeter was really right, Bernard and I, along with one of my PhD students, Kathy Fogel, who's now a professor at the University of Alabama, what we did is we looked at every country in the world and we made lists of its leading firms in 1975. Then we looked at how many of those firms had died, disappeared, gone bankrupt, shrunk into insignificance, and how many were still there. And along the axis, it tells you what fraction of the firms in the economy survived from 1975 to the present. And then up on the side axis going up is the productivity of the country, how fast the country grew, how fast its economy, its standard of living increased. And although there's a lot of scatter, you do get a highly statistically significant negative correlation. The more of your great 1975 companies that survive to the present, the slower your economy grows. And the more of your 1975 companies that went bankrupt, disappeared, dissolved, shrank into insignificance, the more of them that disappear, the faster your economy grows. Now that's a little bit counterintuitive. You'd think that if your great companies do well, the economy would do well. But that's exactly the opposite of what we find. And that's consistent with Schumpeter's idea of creative destruction actually fueling economic growth. Now, university presidents tend to like that because it says innovation, new ideas, and so on, and incubator firms and all these things are probably really important. Bernard showed you this graph showing the tendency of stocks in different countries to move together, moving together up and down in Poland. When I presented this in China, I came up with a way of describing it as harmony in stock prices. The Chinese like everything to be harmonious. And so in China, the stock prices are harmonious. They all go up and down together. And in the U.S., there's disharmony. Some of them go up and some go down. Well, maybe what's going on here has something to do with creative destruction, as well as what Bernard was talking about. Because if you have creative destruction going on in an economy, the creative firms' share prices are going to go up because they're the ones that are stealing customers from everywhere else. And the companies that are being destroyed, their share prices go down. And so you have firm-specific movements being more intense in economies where there's more creative destruction. In economies where everything is placidly going along, there are no new ideas, nothing new is happening, then of course the stock prices kind of just all drift along together. Maybe that's what's going on there, and that might be another possible explanation of this finding. To check this is joint with Hyunbae Chun and Jungwook Kim, who are both in Korea. What we did here is we again plotted the tendency of stocks to move either independently or together. This is the tendency of stocks to move independently on the vertical axis, and on the horizontal axis is the spending on computers in each U.S. industry. The circles are the different industries, and the size of the circle is the size of the industry. But basically what it shows is that the more an industry spends on computers, the more idiosyncratically the prices of stocks in that industry move. So industries where there's a lot of computer spending, some stocks are going up, others are going down. Industries where there's very little spending on computers, the stocks all kind of just drift along together. That's consistent with creative destruction, maybe underlying this idiosyncratic movement in stock prices that Bernard was talking about. The other thing we find is if we plot productivity growth in different U.S. industries on the horizontal axis, and then the tendency of stocks to move independently. Again, we see that the more independently the stocks in an industry move, the faster is the rate of productivity growth in that industry. So if NUS sets up new high-tech firms in an industry, that will probably destroy the old firms, the stock prices will move differently, but the productivity in that industry will advance faster overall. The other thing that we're investigating right now is that there's a lot of time series difference in this propensity of stocks to move together or to move differently. And so what we're trying to do now is to understand that a little bit better. That's kind of our current ongoing research. And I wish I could say more about it, because I think it's fascinating that there's more creative destruction in some decades than others. Creative destruction, of course, doesn't stand alone, because Schumpeter also talked a lot about functional form efficiency of the stock market, the ability of the stock market to fund the right firms. And basically what Schumpeter said is that creative entrepreneurs often lack billionaire parents. I mean, if you're a creative entrepreneur and you want to set up a new firm and your parents are billionaires, you're all set. But if you're sort of a more ordinary person, somehow you need to get like hundreds of millions of dollars to build a new corporation. And although equity financing is not a major form of financing for all firms, it is the major form of financing for high-tech startups. Venture capitalists will give you a bit of money, but ultimately you have to do an IPO and get money from the stock market. And so what Schumpeter said is basically there are two kinds of people. There are entrepreneurs like Thomas Edison, full of ideas with no money. And then there are people we call capitalists. These are people with lots of money and no ideas. And so in finance, we like to call them widows and orphans, because they're the people that invest in the stocks. They don't really know what they're doing. We have to protect them and so on. So I've put little orphan Annie here to symbolize widows and orphans. And basically what happens is a finance guy comes in between. So in this case, this is actually true. J.P. Morgan found Thomas Edison, J.P. Morgan, the great American banker. Morgan took Edison's ideas over to Europe and explained them to European widows and orphans. They had a lot of very rich widows and orphans in Europe at the time because of recent land reform. So all the aristocrats had money instead of land they needed to invest it. Morgan took shares in Edison General Electric to Europe, sold them, carried back suitcases of money, then went back to Europe again with suitcases of money to pay dividends and more shares to sell to the Europeans. He sold more shares to the Europeans, brought the money back to Edison. Edison made more light bulbs, made profits, and it kept going round and round and round and round. And Schumpeter said without that, Edison would never get the money to make Edison General Electric, and we wouldn't have light bulbs. You need a financial system, an efficient, well-run financial system for creative destruction to happen. That's what Schumpeter said. And I think he's right. And trust is critical here. The capitalists have to trust that J.P. Morgan is going to find a genuine, truly creative, interesting entrepreneur with real, genuine business ideas and give the money to him to make light bulbs. They don't want to have a situation arise where they entrust their savings to the middleman and then he goes away and spends it on nice things for his family. Okay, you need trust or the whole thing doesn't work, and that's where the regulations that Bernard was talking about come in. You need an efficient financial system for this particular type of financing. If you don't, then stock prices collapse. Thomas Edison can't issue stocks and raise very much money because he doesn't get much money for each share, and it just doesn't work as well. So let me conclude by saying what we're studying, what we're trying to understand is the secret behind economic growth. And I think what we're saying is that financial development plus creative destruction equals economic growth. That seems to be what if you want to take a bottom line away from 20 years of a research agenda, that's a good bottom line to take. And it's incredibly important because, you know, if you think about all of the people in Nigeria, Africa, Cambodia, how many people there might have been great cancer researchers if they'd had an education, if they'd been able to attend university. Who knows what diseases might have been cured if we'd had more economic development in more places in the world faster. You know, the waste, the human waste is appalling. And once you start thinking about that, as Robert Lucas once said, it's very hard to think of anything else. So we're trying to understand what it takes to develop an economy, what it takes to make an economy grow fast, and what it takes to raise standards of living so that more people whose lives currently consist of digging through the dirt for edible roots might instead be working on stem cells or working fancy microscopes or curing cancer. Thank you.